Hello and welcome to another episode of Chats with Chip. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of SAGA, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am delighted to have with me today Noel Andrews, the CEO and owner of JobRack. Welcome to the show, Noel.
Hey, thanks, Chip. Great to be here.
It is great to have you here, and before we jump into our conversation, why don't you just share a little bit about yourself and JobRack?
Hey, no worries at all. So, based here in London, England, it's not as dreary as people may think. Plenty of blue skies and sunshine. I have a particular kind of favorite set of kind of rooftop bars that I like to frequent whenever we do get the sunshine. And yeah, at JobRack, we help agencies and online business owners to hire really, really great talent from Eastern Europe. And one of the big things that we do is we take all the hard work of hiring out for people, so kind of do really kind of helping people get the kind of the talent that they need.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into what I want to talk about today, shockingly enough, and that is how agencies can leverage talent from Eastern Europe and perhaps other overseas locations more broadly to supplement the work that they're doing, particularly if they're here in the United States. Look, we know that it's a very difficult talent market in a lot of places, but particularly here, agencies are really struggling to put butts in seats and quality butts, preferably. So, how can they, how can agency owners be thinking about expanding their talent pool beyond just their local geography?
Yeah. So the last couple of years obviously has shown us that a lot of us been forced to work remotely, even for the kind of agencies and businesses that weren't already doing so. So the hard bit's done, right? You've proven that you can do it. Now it kind of opens you up. Instead of trying to hire people that are within like, I don't know, 30, 40-mile kind of commute radius. Now you've got the rest of the country, the rest of the continent, the rest of the world. So the first bit is figuring out, right, what are the roles that you need? Are there any particular requirements that mean you might need people in a certain geography, in a certain time zone, with certain kind of access, etc.? Now, most of the agencies that I work with are, looking at, sometimes there are some onshore roles. So we often find people get nervous about putting like an account management role, for instance, or customer success, putting that kind of offshore, further afield. They worry about accents. They worry about that kind of relatability. And that's a very, very common thing kind of early on. What we tend to find is that people will often start off with roles like kind of operations specialists, operations managers, like the technical specialists, so whether it's like SEO analysts or SEO specialists or PPC, people that are a little bit more kind of back of house, but then very rapidly realize that when you hire really, really good people, then actually where they're from, what they sound like really, really doesn't matter. Clients love it when they're seeing really, really great quality and committed people. And then for agency owners, actually then being able to leverage and get the benefit of better value because the people in Eastern Europe or in other areas of the world aren't having to pay the cost of living that we're seeing in the UK, in Canada, in North America, etc. So that gives kind of a huge opportunity to not compromise on quality, and that's the most important thing for me to say, right? When you look to hire remotely, whether it's in the same country or further afield, this isn't about saving money, right? Because if you save money and lose quality, then actually you lose overall. What it's about is getting equivalent or better quality for kind of more affordable rates and actually being able to hire the people in the first place where there is actually an availability of talent, unlike much of the US right now.
Well, and I think you've hit on something really important there, which is that a lot of agency owners tend to think of going offshore for labor being a way to save substantial amounts of money. And if you're doing it right, you're not really going to save a ton of money. You might, I mean, as you say, you may get better value for that money, but if you say, "Hey, I can just get some cheap help," that's not really the way to think about this.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the mindset is very much about where can you, first of all, where can you find the people, right? Because the biggest constraint to the growth of any agency and the success of any agency is having the right people, right? Having enough people to do a really, really great job for your clients so that they become, raving fans and then come back to you and refer you on. That's kind of the number one thing. The second piece, obviously one of the big challenges that we all have as agency owners is that when to hire, right? A lot of people will, we all know that ideally we would hire at maybe 70 to 80% of capacity. In reality, most agency owners are hiring about 120% of capacity. Everyone's getting really stretched. Then they're like, right, I've got enough money. The order book's looking good. We'll hire. One of the benefits of kind of hiring from lower cost regions of the world is that the salaries are lower. and often significantly lower. So if we take Eastern Europe, which is my area of expertise, we're normally talking 40 to 50% cheaper than hiring in the US for equivalent or better quality people. So it can make a substantial difference. What we tend to see agency owners doing is that they kind of leverage that to hire sooner, and so that they can actually safeguard quality of delivery to their clients, hire sooner, scale out faster, and kind of drive their growth, and hopefully work less a little bit themselves as a result.
Yeah, and I think that there's real benefit to getting that higher skill set that you can by stretching your dollars to make them go further, or whatever currency you're using in the business
Yeah.
that you're running, listening to us today. Over the course of my agency career, I have used offshore labor in Eastern Europe, Central America, and Asia. I mean, obviously, you specialize in Eastern Europe. Do you see any fundamental differences between the different regions and perhaps the kinds of roles they fill, or is there really no particular difference, and it's really more the specific groups of people that you're working with?
Yeah. So my first caveat before I answer that is that there are great people available in every country in the world, right? That's the kind of first thing. In some countries, for some roles and some regions of the world, that takes a lot. It's a lot harder to find them, because there might be just some cultural differences that mean they have tendencies one way or another, for instance. So there are, Eastern Europe, if I kind of refer back to that. So Eastern Europe is renowned for people that are really, really hardworking, incredible work ethic, and very direct communication. So if you ask them to do something and maybe your instructions aren't clear, or maybe your instructions are wrong, or maybe there's a better way of doing it. And the old analogy is, if you ask for a square wheel, then often you'll get that. Now, in Eastern Europe, the cultural tendency is very direct, right? Communication is almost blunt, right? Especially for us kind of soft Westerners. And so, if they think something is wrong, or they think you can do it a better way, they will generally tell you. Big kind of cultural stereotype, but generally very, very true, and why a lot of our kind of clients come back to us again and again. There are other regions of the world that is not a thing, right? That much more subservient, much more kind of, the boss is this, massive figurehead that they could never possibly contradict or go against. And that can be challenging, especially when you want people to focus around process improvement, having their eyes and ears open in terms of how to make things better. And especially when you're getting into management roles or specialist roles, right, where you don't want to be managing tasks, you want to be, delegating responsibility and, giving them autonomy and letting them run. So that's probably the biggest difference we see. There's areas of the world that are that's more or less of an issue for. It's one of the key things that keeps people coming back to with us with Eastern Europe, because it's not an issue, and that direct communication is just, that very kind of blunt and straight communication is wonderful.
And you've touched on it now a couple of times, but a lot of this comes down to how you're managing these resources. And so it does take some skill on the part of the team at the home agency, if you will, to manage geographically far-flung resources, whether they're employees or contractors, no matter which part of the world they're in. And so let's talk a little bit about how you effectively manage these resources, because part of it is understanding what cultural differences there may be to make sure that you're giving the proper level of direction. Because I've certainly worked with some of these groups where, as you say, if you ask for a square wheel, you get a square wheel. It may not turn, but by God, you ask for a square wheel, and that's what you'll get.
Yeah.
And so, you really need to understand that, because it changes how you manage things. It changes the processes and instructions that you might give. But I think there are other things to consider too when it comes to management, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's two key things for me. So one is, it doesn't matter how much someone is working for you, whether it's 5-10 hours a week, or whether it's 40 or 50 hours a week. Treat them like a team member, right? Treat them like a full-time member of your team, as if they were, sat around the table with you day to day, right? That is the most important thing. That people get tied up in knots with terminology like freelancers, like remote workers, like gig workers, all this kind of thing. And to me, employees, for instance, and there's lots of legal reasons why, generally remote workers, especially ones outside of your home country, why they're not going to be a true legal employee, right? So team member is what I use, right? And that is what you are looking to build. You should be looking to build a high performing team of people that are working together, right? That's the biggest thing for me. So that's the first bit, is kind of is how you frame it in your own mind as a business owner, and saying, right, I'm going to build a team. I'm going to, make them a high performing and highly functioning team. So what does that take? the number one thing is then communication, right? Putting in really clear communication channels and tools. And when you're all remote, this is actually reasonably straightforward. It just takes a little bit of effort. And it takes effort to have things like team meetings, like stand-ups, whether you use Slack or Teams or whatever kind of tool you choose to use. So that sort of things is actually reasonably, can be straightforward. You just have to put a little bit of time and effort. It's also really important to do things like the relaxed time, right? So if you were in an office together, people would be going for coffee. They would be standing around the water cooler, is the age-old kind of cliche. They'd be going out for lunch together. So it's important when you've got a fully remote team to give opportunities for that kind of like casual kind of chat. So we have a JobRack, we have afternoon tea every Friday afternoon. And we have just a kind of window of time. It's normally about 30 minutes or so. And it's kind of optional, but most of the team come along and it's just kind of free-flowing chat, people just getting to know each other, chatting about what's going on. And so we're doing more things like that just to help kind of foster that team. But yeah, communication is key. And I think if you have a hybrid business, so if you're operating where sometimes people are in the office, but there's still remote people as well, that's actually the hardest approach. And that's the hardest thing to manage, because when people, Chip, if I come up to your desk and have a conversation about something, but we've got Joe that is the other side of the world, or even the other side of the state or the town, and he's working from home today, we've got to make sure that Joe knows about the conversation that we just had if it's relevant to something that we're all working on. So it almost becomes harder. It almost becomes like, oh no, don't come and talk to me here. Talk to me on Slack, because the rest of the team has got to know what's going on. That's a little bit trickier. But again, always a big fan of, synchronous communication, getting people chatting and kind of conversing and generating ideas. It takes prioritizing it. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and this is something that more and more agencies have become familiar with, as you noted, because of what's been going on the last couple of years. A lot of us are very comfortable now speaking in these, video conversations where, 3 or 4 years ago it was, like pulling teeth in order to get someone to hop on a video Zoom call. And so, that piece of it, from a logistical standpoint, I think people are generally more comfortable with, but they're still learning the ropes for some of the things that you've talked about, as far as, really having inclusivity and trying to find ways to make sure that all of the team is on the same page. You did mention something earlier that I want to highlight here, because I think it's a substantial issue that particularly US-based agencies need to consider, and that's time zones. When you're working with employees who are in other parts of the world, understanding how their working times mesh with yours is an important consideration, and something that you need to discuss with any potential overseas resource, so you understand, are they going to be willing to do some time shifting to allow for those kinds of synchronous conversations that you mentioned. And it becomes even more important if it's a role that's more directly tied to immediate client service versus, long-term work. So, how do you, obviously, you're based in England, so, you don't have a huge time zone difference with Eastern Europe. Here in the US, it could be, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours time difference, depending upon where you are. And I know that from the work that I've done in the past internationally, it can be difficult if both parties are not on the same page about how to hash out some of those things. So talk a little bit about how you advise agencies to handle that.
Yeah. So the first thing is to look at the nature of the work. Now, the vast majority of roles that, kind of we help agency owners hire and that agencies in the US are running with, a lot of the work can be asynchronous, right? It does not need to be done, minute by minute, the same hours that you're working in the US. And there are a couple of roles that's not quite the case for, but there's often a lot of flexibility. So, if I take the hardest role, first of all, like a client account manager, right? They're spending a good chunk of their time on calls, communicating with your clients. Let's again go to the hardest scenario, which is someone on the West Coast of the US. There's a 9-hour time difference typically with Eastern Europe. So if you've got a very, very regular set of clients that, are having late afternoon calls, then that's not ideal, because then you're getting into, it's like 1 or 2 in the morning Eastern Europe time. And I am very, very against getting people to work basically what is a night shift, like permanently. It's very, very common in the Philippines, for instance. It's just, for me, like A players, the really, really good people, they've got their kind of choice of jobs, right? So why would they choose to give up hobbies and evenings and weekends being shattered from work for that reason? So what we often look at is we look and say, well, how much of the work needs to be kind of have overlap? We always aim for at least 3 or 4 hours of overlap with, where most of your people in the agency are. And we tend to find that works really, really well. You then get that kind of benefit of the geo arbitrage. So you wake up in the morning and they've done half a day's work already, but they're still online for plenty of the time, getting you through till kind of lunchtime or maybe early afternoon. And that's if you're West Coast. It's very, very common for people in Eastern Europe to work, kind of an evening shift. So maybe from midday till 8 p.m. That aligns nicely with kind of West Coast time for a good crossover. And flexibility is really common as long as you just talk openly about it. So if someone knows that, hey, from time to time they're going to need to flex their calendar to do a call with someone in Australia or New Zealand or West Coast of the US afternoon, that's generally kind of never an issue. So we find that works really, really well. Then when we get into roles like SEO specialists, PPC specialists, where they're more not working in isolation, but their work is not actually kind of time bound with needing to collaborate directly with anyone else so much, then 3 to 4 hours works absolutely great. And if you're on the East Coast or kind of Central Time, then you've got even more hours to play with.
Yeah, and it's like any resource. Even if you had one that was, just down the block, you need to understand, what the expectations are on both sides for working hours and things like that. And frankly, it's becoming even more common here in the U.S. for employees to have, flexible time arrangements with their agencies in order to accommodate personal needs and things like that. The other thing I will note is that, I know a lot of developers that I've worked with who like to work strange hours, right? Who are effectively vampires, and if they see the sun, they're uncomfortable. So I have worked with plenty of developers who basically worked the same schedule that I did, even though they were on the other side of the world. So but it's really just getting those understandings down. And I love that you use the term geo arbitrage, because I think that if you think about the time zone difference as a potential benefit and not just an obstacle, there are opportunities to be potentially had in it. Now, it doesn't work for every role, but if you understand how you can use that to your advantage and you're adapting your own schedules and timelines with your clients effectively, you can maybe take advantage of it or at least mitigate it, right? So let's say that it does take longer to get feedback, right? Because if someone's doing some work overnight, and by the time they get feedback, it's now added a day. Just work that into your timelines with clients. A day isn't going to make a huge difference in the whole scheme of things, and you just need to get really good at estimating those things. But look for those opportunities, because you may be able to use that geo arbitrage, as you call it, to help improve the results that you're producing.
Yeah, definitely. And when you look at, if I give a couple of kind of examples, so, if you're running an SEO agency, for instance, really absolute top end SEO specialists, salary wise, are typically going to run you maybe $3,500 a month. And this is for someone with, 5, 6, 7 years experience. They can be client facing, they can be doing strategy. They're also happy to get stuck in, get their hands dirty as well, like real technical SEO specialists. At those kind of rates means that you can probably hire 2 or sometimes even 3 for the kind of rates that you might be paying kind of locally. And so that opens up a lot of opportunity to, offset, like you said, those kind of, potentially that kind of few hours or day kind of delay that you bring into it, and lets you either drive up quality, do more, handle more clients, things like that. So when the rates are as they are, and like I said, it's for equivalent or better quality without that kind of compromise, and with the actual availability of people, it does open up a huge amount.
So now, some real nitty gritty logistical issues that some agencies I know have run into issues with when they've been hiring overseas talent. How do you pay them? Right. So, what is your general advice there? Because I've seen all sorts of different approaches to paying overseas labor. Is there something that for Eastern Europe in particular that you see, works generally pretty well? Because I think a lot of Americans don't recognize that the financial systems in different countries are different, and not everybody is set up the exact same way, where it's easy to take a wire transfer into your personal bank account here. That's not capable in every part of the world.
Some ways it's tricky. Yeah. So the 2 most common ways, and what we use here at JobRack, is one is Wise, formerly TransferWise, super simple. I've not found an Eastern European country that it doesn't work for, and it just drops straight into their bank account. And the fees are incredibly low. You're talking like less than about 0.5% normally, which is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And then the other one that's very common is Payoneer. Very, very common in Serbia and some of the countries around there. And they have an account. They would just simply send you an invoice and a payment link, and you can make it on a debit or a credit card. Typically a 3% fee, which often actually the worker will pay because it's kind of more convenient for them. But in the scheme of things, it's $30, $60, $90. Depending on kind of the salary level. If if it's an executive assistant or a marketing assistant, it's around $1,000, $1,200 US, talking like $30 in terms of that fee. even at kind of SEO, PPC specialist level, we're maybe talking like $90 per fee. And then the other bonus with that is if you're into chasing kind of mileage points and credit card bonus points, then you can put that spend on a company credit card too.
Yeah, I think the key here is, again, just make sure you're in communication with the individual that you're working with, so you
Exactly.
understand what's going to work for them, and you do need to be willing to be flexible and adapt to what's going to work for them, right? Because ultimately they need to be paid in a timely fashion, and it behooves you to figure out what the best approach for that is. But you do
Yeah.
need to understand it's probably going to be a little different than the way you pay your current employees and contractors, but it's not a particularly difficult process
Yeah.
once you know how to do it. So, um, are there other gotchas that you need to be thinking about when you are particularly U.S. based and looking to hire this kind of talent? Are there? You had mentioned earlier, for example, language skills. How much of an issue is that really? I mean, obviously there are some roles I know in the past where I haven't had much difficulty at all. Again, developer-oriented stuff, as long as you can sort of talk about the logic of it. Accents don't matter, and spelling doesn't matter. But some of the roles, maybe that does. And Americans are kind of snobbish, shall we say, about the use of the English language. Not that you Brits aren't too.
No,
But
definitely.
my
Definitely.
experience is that Americans are not as culturally sensitive, shall we say,
Mm.
to the fact that not everybody knows it exactly the same way you do. Does that matter? Is that a real challenge?
Yeah, so we're very fortunate in the sense that all across Eastern Europe, learning English, it starts from very very early age. There's a huge number of people that then really push with their kind of studies even as adults and in their career to kind of get better and better. Lots of them go into English teaching and kind of really develop from there. And so it's we don't work with anyone that doesn't have at least a good grasp of what I would refer to as like business English, right? You never want to have someone that's working for you that is painful to communicate with, because that just drains you of energy, right? The levels vary about, and it's some of it you don't need it to be word perfect. Some of it you need them to be absolutely spot on. And so we can kind of flex that and vary, but the minimum standard is extremely high, and it's just someone that you can converse with normally. Yes, they might have a bit of an accent, but then hey, so do most of us. And so yeah, that they're the kind of the main things. Is the variety is there, the breadth is there, and it's about figuring out what is it that you need, and then we kind of help you kind of find that. But yeah, not really an obstacle at all. I'm trying to think of other things. I think probably the biggest obstacle is really just for a busy kind of agency owner, business owner, it's just making sure you take the time for your team. And actually, that's no different whether they're in the US, in the same town as you, the same office as you, or all across the world. It's just recognizing that as you grow your team, and this has been a kind of pretty recent realization for me. It's like my number one job as CEO and owner is the team, because they're the ones that are ultimately powering the success of the business. So the more time we invest in communication, collaboration, kind of team getting to know each other and building out from there, that's actually what drives the success. But yeah, no, thankfully the internet, the kind of the world we're in makes things super easy. So payments over things like Payoneer and TransferWise, or Wise as they are now. Ease of communication across Slack and Zoom, and the kind of the strength of internet connections. And again, I mean, Eastern Europe doesn't have any kind of like infrastructure challenges. There's no extreme weather or anything like that. So that, makes for a very kind of stable kind of work environment.
So let's say that at this point, I'm now sold on the idea that I should be tapping into this as a labor resource. How do I go about finding it? And obviously, I know you're biased. Your suggestion would be I pick up the phone, I say, "Hey, Noel, this is what I'm looking for." But talk a little bit about the process,
Mm.
not just with JobRack, but generally, how do you go about finding the right talent? Because it is different than, I mean, you don't just post a job on Indeed typically and find this. So how do you go about doing this and finding the right people?
Yeah. So the first thing, and it doesn't matter where you're hiring, the first thing is figure out what you want and what you need. I see a lot of business owners that jump into hiring, or they think they need one role, and then actually after we have a conversation, it's like, oh, that's not the right role for you to hire right now. It's something different. So first and most important step is figuring out, what's the biggest needs right now, what's the biggest priority, and then thinking, right, what kind of person do you need, what skills and experience do they have, what are the requirements, because that then dictates where you go to hire and where you kind of might need particular skills and geography, time zones, etc. From there, based on that geography, I would always look for specialists in that area. There are sites that operate, completely worldwide, but then, and that can work really, really well. I'm not a big fan personally of just advertising on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn, as an example, they make it way too easy for people to apply. So it's like a one-click application, and you just get a whole ton of poor quality. You're going to get hundreds of applicants. None of them often will be actually any good. So
And that's true, by the way, whether you're looking for overseas or just in
absolutely,
your own neighborhood. I mean, it is LinkedIn
definitely
has
is.
made it
Yeah,
far too simple, and it's really
yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah,
But
it's
anyway,
not good. So I think ideally what you want to do is be having a conversation with someone. So one of the things that I do is I jump on kind of free consultation calls with people, and it's very much about figuring out, right, what's going on for you in your agency right now, what's going on, what's coming up, what role do you think you need? And I, often kind of coach and guide and advise people on, the options to think about. And if I think they should, not hire from Eastern Europe, I'll be the first to say so and kind of guide people in that way. And so ideally what you want to do is speak to someone, either another agency owner that's hired from kind of the region of the world you're thinking of, or hired the roles you're thinking of, someone like me, for instance, or kind of peers, or, other people that in a similar space. Just have these kind of conversations and then get, recommendations and advice. And then when you come into the actual hiring, you've got generally two choices: whether you do it yourself or you get help. Most busy agency owners should not be trying to become recruitment consultants. I definitely don't advise that. You've got way more important things to do with your time, and the cost to get help with hiring is just not significant at all. So yeah, definitely be looking at that, but have conversations with, like I said, with people like me to just understand your options, and then you can make an informed decision.
well, I think people have a lot more information to go with to make that informed decision now that we've had this conversation. Hopefully, folks have gotten that value out of this discussion. I know that I have. If someone is interested in having a further conversation with you or learning more about JobRack, where should they go?
Yeah, simply head on over to jobrack.eu/agency, and there's a whole bunch of information there, and you can click and book in a free call with me anytime.
Fantastic. Well, Noel, I really appreciate the time that you've taken today to explore the options for agencies to expand their talent pool to other parts of the world. I think there's lots of opportunity to be explored there, and lots of things to think about. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate your time, Noel, and I look forward to having you all back again as listeners again very soon.
No worries. Thanks, Chip.